Hi there, I'm Dave Creer from IBM, and I'm here to help you understand a little bit more about containers. What I'm going to show you today is a very quick and easy demonstration of how to use MQ in a container. So we're going to build the container that we're going to deploy to Docker. And the edition that we're going to use today is the MQ Advanced for Developer edition. This is a freely available edition on the IBM DeveloperWorks website. It's also in Docker Hub out there if you want to go look for it there. We will talk through the steps that you would do, which is pretty much the same thing with one additional step if you're trying to do this for a fully licensed version of MQ Advanced. There are the long-term support edition, and then I think there's the container continuous development edition as well. Those are paid for versions that you'll need to purchase from IBM. The steps to create a container for those is going to be the same with one additional step, and I'll help you through that when we get to that point. But what do you need for this? So there's a few things that you need. Number one, you need Docker installed on your machine. Docker 1.7, I believe, is the version that I'm using here. I'm told that you can also use Podman. I do not have that installed, so that's not part of my example, but that is something that you can use if you want. I believe version 1 is what you needed that. GNU Make, that is the build tool that we're going to use to build our base container image. And that's something that you can download and install on your machine. I think I use a Mac, so I used Homebrew to install that on my machine. Because I have a Mac, there's also some utilities for me to use. The GNU Make utility has Xcode utilities that you need to install. Mine were already installed on my machine because I do a lot of things, but you might have to install Xcode utilities, which is not the full-blown version of Xcode, but there are some utilities that you will need from there. If you're doing this on a Windows machine, I believe there's documentation on how you can download and install the GNU Make. That's what you'll want to follow. And then the last thing that you need is you will need a Red Hat user ID and password, and you can sign up for that on the Red Hat site. That's free as well. Okay, so there are 3 steps that we'll need to follow. The first one is we're going to download or clone a GitHub repository. This GitHub repository has all of the files that we will use to build the base container. This does not have the installation binaries for MQ. We'll go get those, or in our case, for the developers edition, it automatically downloads that from the DeveloperWorks site. But if you're going to use a long-term support version or the continuous delivery version, you have to download those yourself because those are licensed software. But for us, we're going to use the developer edition, and we're going to do this really quick. I talked about the 2 steps. The last step is for us to deploy the container that we just built into Docker. So 3 easy steps: clone a repository. We're going to issue the make command, which will then build our base image, and we'll deploy our image. That's it. So last thing we're going to talk about here is the why. So why does somebody want to do this? Well, there's probably lots of various reasons, but I'll give you a couple of my perspective reasons. Number 1 is development. Every developer that I've known likes to be able to do things on their own machine. This gives you the ability to run MQ Advanced on your local machine as a developer edition. There's also, the idea that, hey, I want to go learn MQ. This is a great way to download this, take a peek at what the software can actually do on your local machine without having to purchase a license. So, and then there's the last one, containerization. I know a lot of MQ administrators who have been out there for quite a while. They're really good at what they do, but they have no experience with containers. So this gives you an idea of what it's like to run middleware, such as MQ, in a container. So that's a couple of reasons that I'm seeing in the field where people are wanting to do this. This is not the only way to run a containerized version of MQ. We have cloud packs that are out there, which give you some additional capabilities, but we're going to keep this really simple. We're not talking about Kubernetes here, which will be something maybe we do in another video. We're talking about straight up Docker and the MQ binaries. We're going to stuff those into a container and we're going to run them on our local machine. All right, are you ready? Here we go. Okay, we talked about the first thing we got to do. The first thing we need to do is to download the clone GitHub repo for the MQ advanced make files. So I put a link that's down here that you can go to. This is the GitHub repo. You'll need to clone this repository. So just to kind of show you what I'm talking about is this repository has a couple of branches. Now it's not recommended that you pull down the master branch. What you're going to want to do is come over and find the latest version in the branches. And in this case, it's 9.2.1. So I'm coming to the 9.2.1 branch. This is the file that we want to download. And we're going to download the zip file. So there we go. We have the files. So let's talk just a few minutes about what's in here. So there's a lot of files that are in here that go into the make build routine. And the one file that I will point you to kind of go and peek at and take a look at it. You don't have to make any changes to it, but the make file, this one right here. This is the file that has the instructions for the make command that's going to build our container, okay? That's the one if you want to look at it. It's the same file if you're going to build the developer edition or the long-term support edition or the continuous delivery edition. This is the same file. You're just going to give it a different command. So that's the first thing we do. Once we get done with this, we're going to move on to the next stage, which this is where we're going to build a new directory on our local machine called downloads, and we can put the binaries that you have purchased, if it's for the licensed required editions, this is where you put that binary. Now, in our case, we're going to use the developer edition. This is the one version that you don't actually have to create this download directory. It will create the directory for you as part of the script, and it will download the latest version of the MQ Advanced for Developers Edition. It'll put it in the directory and it'll run the build for you. But this is the only version that will do that. For the other versions that require a license, you are required to go out to Passport Advantage, download those, put those in this directory, then run the make command. Okay? Once that's done, then you're ready to do the deploy for your Docker run command, which will then build the container and deploy your MQ container. So let's look at a few pictures. So that first step that we did, what that's going to do is some of those commands are going to go out to Red Hat and they are going to download a universal base image from Red Hat. That's the first layer of the container. The next thing that it does is it creates another layer, and this layer sits on top of that. And what that does is it puts all of the installation files. It doesn't actually do the installation quite yet, but it places all of those installation files into the container, and then it creates a new container. This container containing the universal base image and the MQ installation files. So this step here has a container. What happens then is it pushes that container into your Docker images repository. So after this step, when you look out at your Docker images repository, you're going to see a couple of new containers. Why? Because it downloads the base image as a container, then it builds a new container containing the installation files. That's a new container image. And there might be another image out there for, I believe, Golang, which is what the make engine is actually using. So you might see 3 or 4 images out in this Docker repository. So that being said, you're done with step 1. Now, in step 1, we talked just a little bit about how it does the builds. There is one thing you have to remember. You do have to have a Red Hat user ID and password, because you do need to log in to the Red Hat portal in the command file just before you run the make command. That gives it the ability to do the download for the base image. And then it creates a new base image with our extended capabilities, which is the binary files for the installation. Now we're ready for step 2, which there's 2 parts in step 2 because Docker allows us to do kind of a stacked command. When you run a Docker run command, if the image that it is looking for is not in your repo, your local repository, it will first go download that image, then it will compile it and run it, okay? So what we're gonna do is, this is the final point, but we need to first run the Docker run command, which is going to pull the missing images. Now, what you're gonna see is in this file is you're going to see that it will pull a new image. Now, this has some installation configuration capabilities in this image. It's going to pull in the missing layers. Now, you already will notice that there are 2 layers in this missing image. There's 2 layers of that image that are already on your machine, and it will say, hey, I already have these layers and I don't need them. That's because you pre-built them in the first step. That's where all of your installation files are. What it's doing in this final step is it's actually downloading and running a Docker build command to build the actual MQ container that we're going to run. Once it's done doing that, it will then put it in the Docker images repository, then it will run it. And when it runs it, now you have a running container. So Docker images that are in our repository, they're just images. We can create hundreds of containers from that image. It's like a blueprint that says, here's all the files to run it. You can run as many instances as you have resources for on your machine. So at that point, you have a Docker runtime container engine running, and you're able to log in and do whatever it is you want to do in MQ. So let's end this and let's move in and let's actually do it. All right, so here's what we're going to do. First, I need to make sure that I'm in the right directory. So let's check the directory that we are in. And we are in the MQ container 9.2.1 because that's the latest version. Your version may be different if it's newer than this. That's okay. But I'm in that directory. So this is the directory that I cloned from the GitHub repo. I opened a command window and I navigated to the expanded directory from that clone. So let's just take a look, make sure. Okay, yep, here's all my files. So the first thing that we need to do is we're going to log into the Red Hat registry because we need that because it needs to go pull a universal base image from Red Hat because that's what we're going to start with. That's the first layer. So let's go ahead and log in with that. Registry. So Docker login registry.redhat.io. So we are authenticated. I have already authenticated to this, but if I hadn't done so already, I would have to use my user ID and password. This is your Red Hat user ID and password. Turns out I've already logged in, so it's all good. We're ready to go. So remember we talked about that make file. Here's that make file. We're going to run that make file. So the command that we need to do this is pretty simple. It's going to say make, and issuing the make command is going to take a look at the directory that I'm in, and it's going to find the make file, and it's going to execute the commands that are associated with this command. The one that we want to do is the build dev server. Now, if we were going to build a advanced server that was the long-term support edition, I would run a different command, which is build its advanced server, and I would have to set a switch that says that it's the LTS version. I talked about this a few slides back. There's a page that shows basically the 3 commands that you can run in here. But for us, we're going to run the build dev server. And if you remember me saying that you don't need to have the downloads directory and you don't need to download anything to run the dev server. But if you're going to run something that requires a license like the LTS or the CD versions for MQ, then you do need to download that software and place that into the downloads directory. So we're just going to do the MQ Advanced for Developers Edition, and we're going to kick the command off and see what it does. So to speed things up, I went ahead and did this prior, so I already had downloaded the necessary files. You may see a few extra things happen, and this may take a little longer for you, but rest assured it should work just fine. It just is going to add one step, which is to download the installation binaries for MQ and place them in the downloads directory. I had previously done that just to speed up some time for you. Again, it will probably take an extra 10 to 15, maybe 20 minutes to download depending on your internet speed. So there we go. We have downloaded some of the images. We're getting ready. This should be some of the final images. And once these are done here, we should be able to look at our Docker images and see what was actually downloaded. Okay, there we go. So let's take a look and see what happened. So we can see in here that it downloaded the necessary image files that it was missing, and it ran through a few Docker builds, and everything looks like it built just fine. So let's take a look and see what we have now. So if I look at my Docker images, I can now see that I have two base images. One is an Nginx and one is the UBI minimal from Red Hat. Now this one here is the image that we will use as the base layer of our image, and it was down, it's 100 meg. I can see that there's a few more that's in here. One is an Nginx, a Go language one, but I'm also seeing that the IBM MQ Advanced Server for Developer Edition is there. This is an image that was stuffed inside the repository and is waiting for us to use. So now that we have all of the necessary kind of layers of the container that we want to build, now we can run the final command. But I wanted to show you kind of the step 2 of how it does all of the build process in that make file, and it's actually pretty quick, easy, and painless. It just takes a good part of 10 to 15 minutes to do that. So I skipped through some of the boring parts of that just so we could speed up the time of the video. So now let's move on to the next and final step. Lastly, we're going to run the docker run command. So the docker run command is going to do two things. There are a few image files that were missing in our local repository. It will pull those missing images, but it's going to use a portion of what we already have because we built that in step 1 and it's already existing on our machine. So it's going to use some of the images that we have in our repository as a few of the layers in our final container. This is the container that we're actually going to run. So let's issue the docker run command. So if I look at this docker run command, I'm setting a few environment variables, a license accept environment variable. There is a Apache 2.0 kind of open source license on this. I'm giving it a queue manager name. QM1 is the name that I'm going to give this particular queue manager, which will be running inside of the container. A couple of ports that I'm going to open up, port 1414 and port 9443. It's the port 9443, which is the web console that we're going to see when this is all done. So that is what we're going to do is run it. Now the name of the container that we're running is the IBM com/MQ. That one's not in our repository. So that's what it's going to pull, but watch what happens when we do this. So the first thing it says is, hey, I can't find this image locally, so I'm going to pull it down. but the first 2 layers that it needs for this image are already on our machine. That's what we just built in the previous steps during that make command, was the layers, the first 2 layers of this image. The rest of these layers are going to need to be pulled down and will be part of the container when it's all complete. So we're going to wait for this to complete and we'll be back. I'm going to speed this up just a little bit. Okay, we've completed the Docker run command. So let's see what happened to our images after the Docker run command. So I'll do a Docker images and let's compare that. Here's the first time we did it. We had 5 images in our container, image repository. Now we have a new one that's in here. And we can see that this one actually is up. These are the images that are in our repository, but there was 2 things that happened. We pulled some images down, we ran a build, look and see what happened to the running containers. So I'm going to do Docker PS, and I can see, and let me just make this a little clearer for you. I can see here that we have a new container that is running. It started about a minute ago, and port 1414 and port 9443 are open on this container. So I know that we should now be able to come in and take a look at the console. So the console is going to be a web browser, and we're going to go to localhost 9443, and it's the IBM MQ/console. Let's see what happens. First thing I'm going to get is, because this is the first time I'm hit the page, it's going to come up and say, hey, your connection is not private. The certificate doesn't match. That's okay. This is just a development server. It's on my local machine. I'm going to hit advanced and I'm going to say proceed to the page. Here we are. Now we're able to get to the MQ console. The password, login and password, is the default login admin password. And I can go in and change the user ID and password, probably recommended, but this is only running on your local network. So there's not a huge risk to it, but I still would do that. Now I'm able to do whatever I want to do inside of the container. It's going to be a development environment for me to use. So that's it, guys. It's as simple as that. I kind of walked through the long way of how to do this. If you get really good at it, you can do this in a couple of minutes, especially if everything's already downloaded and the images are loaded in your repository. But have fun, enjoy, and thanks for watching.